I think that, these people, Mark Carney in particular, that if he backs down, he has no credibility left, right? And he'll be completely mark to market. He's terrified of that.
A whistleblower, a reformer, and one of the sharpest critics of the kind of ESG branding that Mark Carney has built his reputation on. Today, she's here to break down a new analysis that cuts through political spin and to explain what Canadians should be watching next. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back Desiree Fixler. Desiree, welcome back to Northern Perspective.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So, we've gotten through Mr. Carney's first budget. Apparently spending less means almost doubling the deficit that we had last time, and in Justin Trudeau's horrible economic management. It was really shocking to a lot of people that back in the fall, you had a budget deficit that was so embarrassing of 62 billion Canadian dollars that no Liberal wanted to come into the House of Commons and actually stand and speak to it. So they just brought it in, dropped it, and left it there. And then you just heard all these whispers of 62 billion. And then Mark Carney comes in, who was sold as the financial genius. Move over Adam Smith. We have Mark Carney right here. And we have a $78 billion deficit with things in there that Canadians didn't vote for. And we are now being gaslit and told that this is generational spending, generational investment. And if you don't support this, you don't agree with Canada. You've been seeing the economic world from a more macro scale on the global side. But as it relates to Carney and Canada, how have you been seeing this play out as he's navigated being prime minister into his first budget, managing the tariffs with Donald Trump and the other countries? What have you been seeing from your side?
Perfection. He's done it perfectly. He panders that he's going to change things, like removing a very small consumer carbon tax or lowering income tax by a minute amount, but keeps industrial carbon taxes and hasn't repealed any of the net zero chokeholds to unleashing Canada's people's owned resources wealth. And I see this it is the World Economic Forum script. I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy theorist. I'm not suggesting that there is someone in your backyard in Canada. That's not the case. However, it is important to know how influential this vast think tank is and how it has shaped Carney and how Carney has also shaped it. And I'm here because I was actually a member of the World Economic Forum through 2024. Here is my badge. So I am speaking as a practitioner, an insider, and now very much so as a critic, as I was, by the way, during those meetings. I was brought in, I think the WEF maybe wanted a little bit of street cred, get somebody with a different view, someone who was at the time criticizing ESG. I don't think the WEF expected that I would go as far as I have. And so, I think it's important for people to understand how influential this organization is and how it's affecting average Canadians. I mean, it's pretty monumental when you're looking at your monthly costs, your energy bills, inflation, migration issues, digital ID, central bank digital currency. This is all coming from the WEF.
Now, in one of the most recent press conferences over the weekend, Mark Carney was asked about the status of the negotiations with Donald Trump and the tariffs, these tariffs that he sold all the swing voters out there, that this is the biggest crisis in our lifetimes, not the Gulf War, not 9/11, not terrorism, not any of that. No, it's apparently Donald Trump. And that he was the guy that was going to handle Donald Trump. He was the guy that was going to deal with him. He's worked with him. He understands him. He promised multiple deadlines on when to actually get a deal with us. And now he was asked, so, when's the last time you've talked to Donald Trump? And he looks at the report and just says, who cares? Is his ego starting to come through because he's starting to get called out on some of this stuff?
100%. I think he said that there was bravado because he was with his WEF European pals, right? And all jacked up on G20, on the G20 agenda, which, by the way, is very aligned with the World Economic Forum. And I think he got a little cocky. If I'm not mistaken, I think he deeply regrets saying that. And now he is considering a trip to DC. I think he's probably more like begging for it. Let's face it. If he's talking up better trade deals, free trade, how could you not speak to your closest trading partner, the U.S.? How could you write it off as a detail? It affects the livelihood, the employment rate of so many hardworking Canadians. Why would you just push it through? You have to ask this. How could you just write this off? Why wouldn't you throw all your might and get the best deal you can for Canada? It's not a detail. It's important, strategic, it's vital.
Now, one of the problems as a result of not doing this is actually related to a post that you shared on X, where it shows the quality of life of Canadians versus other countries, related to our GDP per capita, which, for those that don't know, that's the slice of Canada's economic pie that you actually make up. And if you think about it as a pizza, and we've done a video on this a long time ago, but you want a larger slice of that whole pizza as your share of that pie. So the smaller our GDP per capita is, that means the less wealth that every average Canadian actually has, which means you don't have a high quality of life like we used to back before this far left liberal regime took over in 2015. So what do you see changing or not changing, and how do you see that influenced specifically by the World Economic Forum policies now that we have been able to kind of see Carney in action and his approach to policy in Canada and climate change and the economy at large?
I don't think Carney's changed his mind. In my dealings, Carney is an absolutist. I don't think he's capable of taking a step back and saying, look, our intention was good. The results weren't. We need to rethink this. We need to repeal, such and such climate rules. We need access to the most affordable and abundant energy. And we should always strive to ensure nature and the environment is preserved. That said, humanity is part of it. And right now, we can't transition unless we have cheaper, more abundant, cleaner alternatives. And today, we do not have that. The other thing that he has to do is admit There is no climate emergency. There is no climate emergency. Even Bill Gates admitted that. So, you've gone about it, Carney and many other European leaders, UK leaders, the Joe Biden administration went about it to just destabilize an existing system, and kind of allow the elite to virtue signal that we're saving the planet and people, when there is no research suggesting that we're in a climate emergency, nor do we have economic data to show that a transition currently to either solar and or wind will sustain our economy. It won't. And I think you need to admit that you were wrong. I think, and there's nothing wrong in that. I think there's strength in actually, saying, listen, we need to adjust now. That is a wonderful goal to have, but it's not feasible now. So let's unleash all of the natural resources that we Canadians own, we jointly own. He doesn't. You do. And unleash that so that you have the economic muscle to fund alternatives, but also unleash innovation. You can't, no one's going to invest in Canada. You're never going to grow your technology sector without having abundant, affordable energy. Make no mistake about it. Technology is a function of energy, and we're in an energy arms race today. Those that are clever about their energy policy and not ideological will win. They will grow the tech hub. Compute is easy. Power is not. So your economy, because we are speedily moving ahead, right? If you want to mention AI, which he loves to do, or quantum, that is a function of your access to affordable, reliable, abundant energy. You need to repeal net zero.
Well, and it's interesting that you mentioned some of that stuff, because I found the biggest indictment of the folks that are trying to convince everybody that the world is on a brink of a climate catastrophe is that recent summit that happened in South America, where you had a massive highway bowled through a whole bunch. Yeah. And this was for a climate accord. So how do you justify mowing down the one of the world's largest rainforests, if not the largest rainforest, that's responsible for a lot of the oxygen that we breathe, and also say, but we're there to talk about the climate crisis? It's something else. And what we say is, when these same people stop getting on airplanes, now it's time to worry. Because if they really believed that the world was on the brink of climate catastrophe, you wouldn't see these people getting on airplanes, expending jet fuel, flying all over the world.
No, you wouldn't.
And I think it's interesting that Mark Carney, I think he gets very annoyed with domestic policy. I think he thinks it's beneath him, and it's just an irritant to him, which is why he's constantly trying to put himself in other positions where he's talking with other world leaders. I think he loves being at the G20. He loves being at these summits because it's more macro for him, and just the average issues in Canada are irritants to him. But to your point on energy, I think I think the Conservatives actually in Canada have a very clever strategy, even though people try to come after them and say, no, you don't care about the environment. Well, they actually do, because but they also understand economy and transition, and paradigm shifts don't happen overnight. So what does Canada need to do? Well, Canada should transition as much as possible over to things like nuclear and hydro, because they're sustainable and they have a constant flow of power into the grid, whereas solar does not, wind does not, and those other renewables, they are extremely problematic for people that actually work in the power industry to regulate that flow because it's not constant. And that's the
And the other thing is,
challenge.
there's a dirty secret there, because remember, when you're building your panels and your wind turbines, first of all, you're giving a lot of jobs to China because they're in control of that supply chain, right? That's what the only reason why China signed up and was President Cop was like, it's wonderful to have this whole kind of Western buy-in on, an energy transition because it's a boom for their manufacturing sector. But understand that those wind turbines, those panels, are being produced by coal. And just think about the shipping costs. So it's not as if at the end of the day, when you tally everything up, it's not that that's clean, right? Now, I love Elon Musk's dream of capturing, unlimited energy from the sun, having, panels up in, space and, harnessing that. I get that. We should dream. We should always look at, the cleanest, most affordable, most reliable, source of energy. But right now, solar and wind, we're just not there yet. And remember, as much as, and I always find this crazy, as much as Carney talks about, I've flown into Asia and I've flown into, the Middle East to talk about Canadian strength in clean energy. It's like, huh? That's that's produced in China. You're strengthening the Chinese, huh? You can
I also think it's funny.
LNG.
He's flying to Saudi Arabia to talk to the world's largest oil producer.
That's right. Honestly, it defies it. You actually watch it and you're like, this is like the upside down. Now, I completely understand. I mean, of course, there is, great talent in Canada, great companies, but there are natural resources. That's why Asia would love, and Europe would love to do more trade deals, is to unleash your LNG. And you got to be real. And that's, done the right way. That will unleash greater trade, more jobs for Canada, greater economic growth, greater prosperity and funding that can go into further innovative ideas. I don't understand how he can cap, or how Mark Carney through the WEF has the ability to cap the natural resources that the people own. No one voted specifically on net zero, just like here in the UK. People are really struggling with the affordability crisis, energy prices. So as oil and gas keeps going down, our electricity bills keep going up, right? And, our politicians try and blame it on market spikes. That's not the case. They try and blame it on, the grid isn't ready, we need upgrades. No, it's because there are taxes and there are issues in hooking up renewable sources to the grid. That's the issue. That's what's driving up electricity prices. That is the truth.
Yeah. It's a massive issue in hooking up these renewables. And the analogy I would use is, so assume your grid is a bucket of water. The grid is always full because energy always has to be traveling, and you can't just have energy stop. So energy is always traveling within the grid, and it's always powering something, and it's always being generated by something. So it's always full. So if you want to say, okay, so now we're going to add renewables, well, the renewables, they don't have a steady rate of flow because sometimes it's not windy and sometimes it's not sunny and sometimes it's night. So you don't have a constant rate of flow of electricity coming from these renewables, and that makes it very problematic for the men and women that actually manage our power grids. So if if you want to talk about renewables, then you have to talk about mass energy storage. That's what you need to talk about, because you have to have that between the renewables and the grid to make it work for anybody's worthwhile. But now you're talking, to your point, that just is another problem where you have to say, all right, well, that's going to introduce another problem, another issue in hooking it up to the grid, and more money, and it's going to be more expensive to do that. So that's why
Well, the other thing is that you also run the risk of blackouts because,
yeah.
again, that's what happened in Spain and, southern France. So what you have is that, the grid was overloaded and they could not stabilize supply and demand. And so what happens is the entire grid just turns off. And that was catastrophic. That was like, can you imagine a day, everything goes down, right? You're on your subway, you're on your train, you're driving, lights out, you're trying to buy water, everything's off, right? So that's, we've seen this happen, right? It is a real risk that we are, not just that it is so expensive, as you mentioned, to upgrade, but that it's very hard to even manage the grid today.
Well, and this is where we need to be leaning into nuclear. We need to be leaning into fusion. But in order to actually get there, we need money to get there. So this is where I think the Conservative plan makes a lot of sense. And it's environmentally conscious, because they're saying, listen, we have all this natural gas and we have all this energy resources in Canada. Ship it over to the dirty countries and let's export our gas technology to them, and we can make money setting up natural gas power plants over there. We can replace coal, we can displace all that, reducing the carbon footprint on the environment. And while we're helping them do that, we are transitioning from gas over to nuclear and potentially fusion when it's in a good when it's in a good technological spot where it's available for the commercial market. But that makes sense, and that transition isn't happening, and it underpins the whole point of this net zero green trend. Like, you cannot go from 100 to 0 and then say, oh, great, we transitioned over to green. Well, that's great. Nobody has power. Everybody's poor. Nobody has jobs. Nobody has food. But at least we're not putting out any emissions. Why don't you just, send us back to the dark ages where everybody's a serf?
Look, and the other thing is, like, why is Mark Carney, I call him the carbon counter, why is he so obsessed with carbon emissions? Look, there's no crisis, there's no climate crisis, but there is climate change, right? And we need to monitor that. But carbon emissions are in itself, it's not a pollutant. But there are other pollutants in the world. And somehow we got so distracted on bean counting carbon emissions and forgetting about clean air, clean soil, clean water, and that is some sort of very peculiar ideology. And that's something that I always raise to discredit the World Economic Forum or to discredit net zero. I think we can all say, most of us, most people, we're good people. We're human, we err, but we're good people. We want a better world, right? We want to work hard. We want a cleaner world, right? No one, wants to go back to the days of before we had all of, I'm a big believer. I would love to have a libertarian society, but that's just not going to happen. It's not realistic. So we do need to have some regulation for the environment, for nature. But net zero that's not achieving it. It's bean counting carbon emissions at the expense of economic prosperity and also at the expense of nature. I know sometimes President Trump gets criticized for exaggerating when he's criticizing the wind, the wind turbines killing, whales and killing, bird life. But that's a truth. And it's also a truth that guess what? Guess what's used? Steel and concrete. Right? How do you manufacture that? So there's this loss of common sense. And coming back to Carney, will he change? I don't think so. I don't think that's in his DNA to take a step back to say, you know what, I'm making a U-turn here, right? We got this wrong. He's already had the opportunity. Also on U.S. trade, he had the opportunity. I'm not suggesting that the U.S. administration is easy or Trump is easy, but you got to figure it out. Even the European Union figured that one out, right? Even the Swiss just got a deal, right? It's very, very feasible, but you can't come in with all this ideology and also smugness and arrogance. And unfortunately, I'm going to say this, Mark Carney, especially with his just a detailed comment, is incredibly arrogant. It's very much, and I've seen this at the World Economic Forum in the meetings, there is this belief, they believe they're morally superior. They have the answers. We, the people, don't. And so there's this belief, you have to have top-down control, right? The state needs to make the decision because we're kind of ignorant. And that was always the argument I would have with them in these, WEF meetings, is to say, you guys never open up an electricity bill. You don't see, right, the crunch. You're a vested interest group that is built on this ESG net zero, this climate it's a multi-trillion-dollar industrial complex. You claim, and your slogan is to save the planet and people. And the last thing you ever think about is actually what's happening to citizens around the world because of this imposed net zero policy that none of us signed up for.
Now, there's a lot of attention now on Mark Carney and China, and he's trying to now say that, there's this long overdue meeting that we've had with China, whereas 4 months before he was asked, who are you planning on looking at trade deals with, and he was on record and saying, well, there's some countries in Asia that we can build these partnerships with, and with shared values, and those values don't include China. Meanwhile, now he's over with China, having meetings with Xi Jinping and talking about a strategic partnership that Anita Anand was there to do. Never mind the fact that China has repeatedly been has been interfering within our democracy, has been interfering within our society, has been harassing the people that have immigrated from China there. What do you think his game is with China, and does it have anything to do with him visiting China right before he decided to run as the prime minister to secure a $250 million loan for Brookfield?
So, and I don't have that many insights into that. I read what you're reading. I think it deserves investigation. Right now, I would say, look, at the end of the day, China is looking to acquire energy on a massive scale, right? They are very focused on powering their economy. They have no religious beliefs on where the energy comes from. They ultimately want to be self-sufficient, right? But right now, they need the offtake from everywhere. We'll see what happens. I would imagine that Carney also considers talks with China an irritant for Trump, and maybe he's considering that's a lever. It won't be, as we saw with Ford. Right? These things, like, don't try and one up him. Like, you know, like there are a couple of people in the world you don't want to pick a fight with. Donald Trump is one of them. The other one's probably Elon Musk. They will never back down. You're never going to corner them. Like, that's not like, so I'm not suggesting that Canada, like Mark Carney needs to, get on his knees in front of Trump. Not at all. We've seen other powers coming in and negotiating deals where there's also reciprocal investment from the Americans there, shared technology, shared defense. But he needs to speak honestly. He needs to be a leader for Canadian people. He needs to get this deal, and playing around with China. China's in it for itself. Remember something. China has no concept of free trade, right? They were the greatest most people think like, oh, Donald Trump just tore up, the whole world order on free trade. Like, no, remember, China already did that, right? So, they're not going to sit there for a fair deal. They're going to get their deal. And I'm not one to criticize that, but, they're far away. We're here just below the border. Like, why wouldn't you do the easy thing, right? Just break bread. Hey, Elon Musk has had to do that, right? You saw the two of them like break bread recently. They got into a fight, and now, right, a few months later, they're friends again. Mark Carney can do this, but he needs to swallow his ego, right? Put the people first, and just like stop with like all the bureaucracy and the technocrat things and ideologies, and just sit there and cut a deal that will be prosperous, because you're going to be bleeding more and more jobs south of the border. It's happening.
Yeah, it happens every day. And every passing week, we hear of another plant closure. And Mark Carney and the Liberals have become so desperate that they're trying to claim any business deal with any other country as a win for Canada. Like, there was one last week where Germany signed a deal with Lockheed Martin Canada for some combat systems, and we had to tell everybody, you understand that's American company, right? Like, you understand that Lockheed Martin owns Lockheed Martin Canada, so all the profits or anything that's coming into Canada as a result of that deal goes to Lockheed Martin. And Mark Carney and the Liberals had nothing to do with that. Everybody understands that, right? But this is the issue, that he's trying to claim every potential perceived win as his own when he didn't earn it. And Pierre Poilievre last week put out a devastating critique of Mark Carney, in that he has been in power since March of this year, and he has not managed to reduce a single tariff on our country. And that should tell you all you need to know about the alleged genius master negotiator. Nothing's been done. And all of these quote unquote trade deals that he's done with these other countries, that doesn't mean that money is coming into Canada. That just means, sure, we have free trade with them. But what companies in Canada are now going to all of a sudden start exporting across the world when they never have before? It's going to be twice as expensive as dealing with the tariffs and still dealing with the United States. So this is the issue, where he's signing all these phantom deals, but I don't see it actually being a positive impact on Canada's economy. Is that, you're the banker? Is that right?
100%. And remember something, there's a big difference between a pledge, like a memorandum of intention of, right? That's a very different situation to commitments and actual investment. So I saw the headline of like 70 billion from, UAE. Yeah, there is talk that there could be back and forth trade right? But that is very different from a specific, here is the investment, this is the location for the plant that we're building, here are the people we're hiring, this is the talent we need, right? So it's, as far as I can tell, it is form over substance. These are slogans to appease, citizens. He needs to be held to account on all of this. Like, show me the money. Where's the 70 billion, right? And look, the easiest win, and it's the low hanging fruit, is just make a deal with DC. Just do it, right? Just get over everything. And by the way, also put Washington, the greatest leverage that Canada has to get the best deal is for you to repeal net zero so that you have competing pipelines and you can put the Americans in competition. I shouldn't be saying that as an American, but that is the truth. You want the best deal? Drill, baby, drill, unleash it, right? And now the Americans are like, oh, we're not the only ones. Like, yeah, they might have to pay more, right? It's against my country's interest, but that's the truth. That is your best, leverage, is repeal C-69, industrial carbon taxes, unleash those pipelines, go straight across, that's in your best interest.
Well, and again, just make it a new mission to, if you want to measure it by carbon, fine. Then measure it by your success in exporting LNG to Asia to reduce the amount of emissions by both India and China. Just that, Pareto diagram. Those are the two biggest polluting countries on the planet. So drill all that oil up, convert it to liquefied natural gas, and sell it. Get rich, and you help the environment at the same time. This is not complicated, but they want this to be complicated. And the biggest question that comes out of this, and I'll ask you, and I'll tell you what an MP recently said about this. So if this is provably a bad idea, and we've seen this net zero regime, why are they intent on continuing to do it?
I think
is it delusion or
it is the right question to ask. There is this belief, they know best. I think it has to do a lot with ego. You just can't admit that you're wrong, so you double down on what you're doing. That's the best way I can explain it. I would show all the economic data when I was in the room and say, net zero investment wise, right? And clean energy is not working, right? And you can track it. The S&P 500 versus the S&P Clean Energy Index, right? Over 10 years, you would lose a lot of money had you invested in clean energy versus making a lot of money in the S&P 500, the overall market. You can show that in net zero aligned countries, electricity prices are very high. People are suffering. You can show, and even the Spanish admitted, the blackout was caused by renewable energy. And it's now very much, their gas use has gone through the roof because they have to stabilize their grid. So they have to reduce, right, the solar energy source. There is an inability, I've just found, from Klaus Schwab, from Keir Starmer here in the UK, Ursula von der Leyen, lots of Democrat governors, Gavin Newsom, in the States, Hochul in New York, and certainly Mark Carney. There are just blockers on, right? There's no critical thinking. There's no reprocessing. It is just simply, they don't go to first principles. They go to their indoctrination. There is a climate crisis. That's as far as they think. There's a climate crisis. People are dying. The migration issue is because of climate change. Everything in our life is because of climate change they blame on. And I guess they think they've seen success that with fear mongering, you get votes, you get contracts, right? And if I think that, these people, Mark Carney in particular, that if he backs down, he has no credibility left, right? And he'll be completely mark to market. He's terrified of that. So there is this, the best way I can describe it, they double down. There is an inability to assess, to adjust, right? And they've seen that, they've experienced that this has been a vote winner. Mark Carney's gotten incredibly wealthy on this because it is also a multi-trillion-dollar industry. And that, he can just write it out. I've never been in a room where someone sat back to think about, or to admit intentions are different from results. And we need to look at what has the outcome been, let's look at the results of this. Because, by the way, net zero has been around for a long time, this whole ESG movement. These religious people, they're religious in their left-wing state control ideology. There isn't that ability to take a step back and say, we got COVID wrong, we got net zero wrong, we got, surveillance and digital IDs wrong, we got open borders wrong, right? And unchecked migration. It's, I don't find it. I'm going to say something. I find that there's so much more intolerance and cancel culture from the left wing than there is on the center or the right side. We have debate. We can bring everything up. I'm the first one to admit I was a believer. I was the biggest champion of ESG. I supported net zero, right? I was here. I signed up for this. I got it wrong. And I learned over time, you look at the data, you reprocess, rebalance, and adjust.
Yeah. And it's actually, your answer isn't too far off from one of the MPs that was recently asked a similar question. Because she was asked, why are they doing this? Why are they putting in these policies? And if it doesn't even seem to work. And her answer was, because they think that this is how they will stay in power. And that's it. That's the only reason. So that was her thought on it. So I think your thought about fear is a powerful motivator, but only to a point. The trouble with fear and the trouble with this type of thing is humans become desensitized to high emotional states over certain things. So when you're trying to tell people over and over and over again, and we saw this in COVID, right, where this virus has potential to affect all of the world, and there's going to be millions of deaths and all of this stuff. So people were afraid, they took it seriously, and then nothing happened. And so we started getting decisions made by governments that didn't make any sense and were contradictory and all of this. And this is where I think you're starting to see with people around the world with the whole climate emergency. Well, the climate has been an emergency for the last 50 years. And one of the biggest problems they're going to have is, one of the recent stats from NASA is that they've actually seen more ice build up in the Antarctic South Pole than they've seen in decades. And so the climate emergency cannot explain that, right? So you also have people that were listening to Mark Carney during the election and saying this is the biggest crisis of our time with Donald Trump and yada, yada, yada. And nothing's been done. So I think his shelf life is starting to be set, I think, because he can't come back to and play that same card. It's not going to work the second time, I don't think, because people will just say, well, what happened the first time? You said this was the biggest crisis of our times, and the first thing that you did was not sign a deal, and you went on vacation for the summer. So I think it's going to be interesting to see this, and I think he thought that this was going to be easier than it was. I think he thought that he would get a majority government. He did not. And he's finding that politics is not the same as sitting in a boardroom and telling people what to do.
100%. And making nice with Europe. We're trying to strike a deal with Germany. That is the second worst performer in the G7 after Canada. Like, two sinking ships can't help each other. I hate to say that. And so I think this is his world trips. It's all posturing, photo ops, form over substance, and reality will set in. There's no doubt. As you're seeing in the UK here, where local elections are, tremendously against Labour, right? Midterm elections against Labour. There's no doubt here. If you called an election, I think Reform would get in. Not even the Tories, it would be Reform. And again, we've seen how, things have shifted in the U.S. There's a reality. We have a lot of urgency today, and we need strong leadership because we do have an affordability crisis. We do. We also have a low birth rate crisis. That is true. We have an immigration crisis, an issue. We do. We need welfare reforms. We need checked migration. I'm an immigrant, right? I'm all for it, but you have to go through the legal, hoops, and you can't be a pariah on the state. And you need to ensure that you're maintaining your own identity, your culture, your sovereignty. And finally, of course, we have geopolitical issues, right? Carney is part of this whole European contingent warmongering, with the Ukraine, right? I'm not suggesting that it's an easy peace deal, but that is an existential crisis. If we're not here in 5 years, it's not because of climate. It's because there is some sort of nuclear war, right? And when you ask people, and we live in democracies, what are key voting issues? It's generally the economy expressed different ways, and it's immigration, it's safety, right? Climate, in the top 10 issues, I don't even think it comes 15. Truthfully, it's not there. And while there is climate change in some parts of the planet are experiencing some harshness, remember that other parts are experiencing bounty. Carbon dioxide also drives, the green planet, right? We need it. It's vital. 10 times more people die from cold than from heat. You have in Europe here, they restricted air conditioning during a heat wave. We always have heat waves. Well, guess what? Restricting fossil fuels that power air conditioning actually kills people, right? So why don't you just allow the economy to power air conditioning so, you don't kill as many people and you power the economy for better, cheaper, more abundant alternatives to whatever you're using. I think that's just really logical. And I think this ideology The days are numbered. People are seeing the outcomes. They're speaking up more. There's not as much cancel culture, as much as the WEF also talks about misinformation. Like that's one of the existential dangers, right? What you and I are doing right now is an existential threat. We're
Oops.
thinking out of the box. We're challenging, right, the WEF ideology. What we know is that there's so much, higher quality citizen journalism. The real information is getting out there. I do so many university lectures and say, look, here's here are like the two different views, right? There is a camp that says there's a climate emergency, and there's another actually bigger camp that says there isn't. But it's for you to decide, right? Here is capitalism, here is socialism, right? Read up on both, the history, the outcomes, for you to decide. But what we can't do is what the WEF does, is top down impose an ideology, right? And pretend these other views and don't exist, and squash debate and squash economic data that comes out. No, time's up on that.